So I'm just going to share with you a little technique for creating a little bit more EQ separation in your mix, particularly when you've gotten to the end of the mix and you're finding it's not quite cutting it. So you've done all your broad stroke stuff, you've done what you can with micro adjusting stuff, you've got some nice stereo separation, but still the tracks seem sort of a little bit gummed together and a little bit indistinct from each other. So the first step is just get a basic parametric EQ. You want something that's got at least 10 bands on it, and you want to start off with the lowest instrument in your mix. So that might be the kick or the drums, or it might be the bass. Put that parametric on the bass, take one point in that EQ, create a bell, and very narrow Q, so width of that bell, and pump it up a bit, so maybe 3 or 4 decibels, something like that. Just sweep it around the low end while the instrument is playing, soloed, until you find you can hear the sort of root fundamental frequency of that instrument. So if you're talking about a kick, that might be 60 Hertz or 70 Hertz or something like that. Once you've found that, you drop that back down to 0, keep that narrow Q, and now create an additional point at every single doubling, i.e. harmonic, of that frequency. So if you're starting with 60 Hertz, then you've got 60 Hertz, 120, 240, 480, etc., until you run out of EQ range. And for each of those points, you want to be gradually widening the Q, i.e. the narrowness of the bell. So say the first one has a Q of 4, the next one maybe have a Q of 2.4, next one 1.8, next one 1, etc., etc., etc. At the wider side of things, in the high frequencies, you can't hear much difference between frequencies that are close together, whereas in the low end you can. So at the low end you're talking about maybe 10 Hertz to hear a very strong subjective difference. At the top end you're talking maybe 500 Hertz. So you do that, and then you take that first instrument, and you can either do this with the rest of the mix playing or separate to it, solo. If you're experienced, it's fairly easy to do it solo. If you're not, then maybe do it with the rest of the mix playing. And what you want to do is you want to pump up and drop down those different harmonics as feels good, i.e. to whatever extent sounds good in the mix. You want to bear in mind at the same time that you're going to be conflicting with different instruments as you adjust these points. So if you're talking about a kick, then maybe you want to pump up the 60 Hertz or the 120 or whatever sounds appropriate for that. But once you get to around 240, 480, you need to listen to the mix as a whole and not just what sounds good for that instrument, and preferably cut stuff, because it's usually going to be conflicting with other stuff in the mix. But use your ears, hear what sounds good, all right? So that's the first stage. Then you go to the next instrument up in the frequency chain. So if you've started with the kick, maybe the next one is the bass, right? And you do the same thing, but in this at this point you're trying to remove whatever amount of amperage sounds good for those root fundamentals of the lowest instruments. So in this case, in this example, we're talking 60 and 120 Hertz. So you're removing what sounds good at that range, and then you find sort of the point in that harmonic series which sounds best for that instrument, and you pump that up a little bit, hear how that sounds, just to whatever sounds good, right? And you keep on doing that with the different harmonics, bearing in mind that you are going to be conflicting with other instruments. So use your brain. If you're upping a bass, then you probably don't want to be upping frequencies around the 15 kilohertz region, because that's going to be another instrument's territory. So you've got to use your brains to a certain extent. You keep on doing that for all of the different instruments, going up and up the spectrum. So kick, bass, if we're talking a rock mix, then maybe guitars or synths comes after that, and vocals, and then the top end of the drum kit, whatever. You just do that for all of the different instruments, and as you progress you should start to find that everything in the mix starts to sound a little bit more distinct, a little bit more unique, and ironically what you should find is that when you cut away certain frequencies in a particular instrument, the instrument should subjectively start to sound psychoacoustically louder because it's not being blended in with these other instruments anymore. Once you've finished all of those instruments, you might have to go back through, particularly if it's your first time doing this, and adjust the lower instruments in that space again, just to make up for anything that you got wrong or where you overcompensated or whatever. It can be quite useful when you're doing this to have some kind of an EQ where you can have a sort of an overall slider and pump up or reduce the differences that you've made. Isotope Ozone has this. You can just sort of slide it, say if you slide it up to 200%, then it's going to double those cuts and those gains that you've made in that EQ. And that can be a useful way of just, increasing that separation that you've made or not. And what you should get out of that by the end of the whole thing is something where all the different buses, all of the different main instrument groups sound a lot more defined, a lot more separate, and the mix as a whole just sounds a lot more dynamic. So I hope that helps a little bit. There are some plugins which can sort of do a little bit of this work for you. I know that Isotope Neutron, I think it's called, has some feature where you put something on the bass, put something on the keyboards, and then you kind of tag team them together and they show you where those instruments are masking each other, that sort of thing. But this technique you can do with any EQ. You don't have to have a special plugin, and it just kind of works. It's particularly good towards the end of the mix because sometimes towards the end of the mix you've put on so much compression and so much limiting or whatever that some of those lower frequencies, lower gain frequencies in the different instruments have been bumped up quite significantly, and by that point they're starting to mask other instruments again, so it sort of compensates for that whole thing. Alright, hope that helps.